Okay, so we finished talking about a specific job attitude, job satisfaction. We talked about the antecedents, the causes of job satisfaction, how we measure job satisfaction, and then finally the outcomes or the results of having higher job satisfaction. We're now going to move on to another major work attitude that organizational psychologists have really been focusing on, and that's organizational commitment. It's defined as a relative strength of an individual's identification and involvement in a particular organization. So there is a strong relationship between organizational commitment and job satisfaction, but it is not a strong enough relationship to say that we're measuring the same thing. So notice the definition is somewhat different. So again, it is an affective response. It's a positive or negative attitude, but it's the relative strength of that attitude as regarding to the individual's identification. In other words, how much you identify, how proud are you of being a part of an organization. So, for instance, if you have low organizational commitment and someone asks what you do for a living, you might say, well, I'm a college professor. Oh, where do you teach? Just somewhere in the Midwest. That would be fairly low identification. I'm more identifying with my role and the job that I do than the organization. Compared to, I'm a college professor at Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. Go Cougars! That would be high identification. And it's also how involved you are with a particular organization. In other words, how important is the organization and the social construct of that organization to your general social life? So again, someone with low organizational commitment very well may still be performing well in an organization, but they probably aren't joining in on additional activities. They probably don't go to like Christmas parties. They probably do not get involved themselves in like various committees or projects to make the workplace better. There's a low level of involvement beyond their specific task roles of their job. So you can tell organizational commitment is more closely tied a lot of times to contextual performance, how likely you are to go above and beyond, than it is necessarily with actual just task performance. Organizational commitment and job satisfaction, they are related, somewhere between 0.3 to 0.4. In other words, each one explains about 9 to 16% of the variance in the other. So that's a lot of variance that's not explained by each other, which means that though there's a little bit of an overlap between job satisfaction, again, the higher you're satisfied with the job, the more likely you are to be somewhat committed to the job. And the more committed you are to the job, the slightly more likely you are to be satisfied. There's been some discussion of is there a causal order? In other words, does job satisfaction result in organizational commitment? Does organizational commitment result in job satisfaction? And the research is kind of out. This is a hard question to actually ask because to track that over time is relatively difficult to do. I think the answer, honestly, is a bit of both. That both they are somewhat related. If one goes up, it probably has a little bit of an effect on the other, a causal effect. So if you become more committed, you probably do become more satisfied. If you become more satisfied, you probably become a little bit more organizational committed. But it's not necessarily like one always leads to the other. Some suggest that commitment is a broader and more stable than job satisfaction, and there has been some research that actually finds that, again, organizational commitment seems to be a little bit more stable in individuals. Those people that are more committed to organizations tend to stay committed to organizations, though this might be an artifact of the fact that also if you're committed to an organization, you're more likely to stay with that organization. So as far as, so basically if you are not committed to an organization, you're probably going to switch from organization to organization to organization, and at each one of those you'll have low commitment. If you're committed to an organization, you're probably going to just stay with that one organization. So Myers and Allen suggested that there's three major components to organizational commitment, and this has been strongly supported by research, and most of what we're going to talk about is the importance of one particular type of organizational commitment. So there's affective commitment, continuous commitment, and normative commitment. Effective commitment means employees are emotionally attached to the organization. It's a strong belief and an acceptance of the organizational goals and values as your own. So if you have effective commitment, you believe that the organization you're in matches your own values, that you value what the organization does, you're proud of what the organization does, and you think that the organization is doing good. Willingness to exert effort on behalf of the organization, and a strong desire to remain a part of the organization. You want to be in this organization, and you're willing to work extra hard for the organization. That's effective commitment. Continuance commitment is somewhat sunk costs. It's basically associated with the cost of leaving. It basically means I've already put in so much time and it would be so difficult to start again in another company. So continuance commitment often includes, well, I've already been here for 10 years, I've already gotten 6 promotions. If I switch companies, how could I find a company that would let me come in at this level? So continuance commitment in organizations such as universities with faculty members is often once a faculty member gets tenure. That basically means they've put in 5+ years at that university, and now they basically get both a title promotion, but also a pay promotion, and they're effectively much harder to be fired. They've got certain protections, certain job security. When you leave a position that you have gotten tenure at, a lot of times you will not be going to a position that will immediately give you tenure again. You usually have to go through a process to get it again. So that would be continuance commitment. The only reason that you're staying with the organization is that the costs of leaving are too high. And finally, there's normative commitment. It's a moral obligation to continue employment with an organization. We often find normative commitment in cultures that have a more collectivistic viewpoint. So the needs of the many, the needs of the group are more important than the needs of the individual. That would be a very normative commitment reason to stay with an organization. But we'll also find it within individuals and individualistic cultures, where basically I'm staying because they gave me a job when no one else would. I feel obligated to stay. Now, the reason we want to look at these 3 different components of organizational commitment is that when we actually look at the framework for organizational commitment, it's a lot harder to influence with antecedents, continuous and normative commitment. Once we have continuous commitment and normative commitment, they rarely are very strongly related to the outcomes or consequences. In other words, continuous commitment is not a strong predictor of increased performance or increased likelihood not to be absent, etc. It basically predicts turnover. That's about it. You're staying not because of a strong love or desire to be with the company. You're staying just because you feel like you're stuck. Same with normative commitment. You're staying because you feel an obligation. Those 2 types of commitment are unlikely to lead to someone working a lot harder and an increase in either task or contextual performance. But affective commitment does relate to those things. So we want to increase organizational commitment, but what we're usually targeting is specifically affective commitment. So this model is going to look a lot similar. Once again, we have the antecedents and the consequences, and in the middle, the organizational commitment. Antecedents in this case include organizational mechanisms. So these are efforts by the organization to increase commitment. They include socialization plans. They include basically branding the organization, logos, insignias, programs for family members. They include getting information out, newsletters, and also reward systems. Again, individual and personality characteristics, age, job level, and stress are all big predictors of organizational commitment, regardless of what else is going on in the organization. And once again, social factors. So the relationships you have with coworkers, your participation in social interaction with those in your organization, again, the role that you have in that organization, and also your relationship with your supervisor. All of these influence your levels of organizational commitment, and organizational commitment, especially affective commitment, is related to performance, is negatively related to withdrawal behaviors, and is negatively related to counterproductive behaviors. So we're going to go through each of the antecedents and each of the consequences. So again, organizational mechanisms. Companies, merchandise, and reward systems do lead to effective commitment. So basically, if the company is giving you free shirts and free hats, if you decide to start wearing them, it's basically letting the world know this is the company I work with. And it starts actually that behavior of outwardly supporting the company through wearing its merchandise also does lead to an internal affective increase in organizational commitment. The more the company actually provides reward systems that again are actually something you value also leads to this affective commitment. Individual personality characteristics. There are just some general individual differences related strongly to affective commitment. Age. The older you are, the more likely you think positively about your company. And that also has a tendency to be connected to tenure, but it isn't necessarily the same thing. Age, regardless of the company, how long you've been with a company, the older you are, generally the more positive you are about the companies you work for. And in addition to that, the longer you've worked for that particular company, tenure, the more likely you think positively of the company. There's a much stronger relationship, generally speaking, that we find between tenure and continuous commitment than tenure and affective commitment. So again, the longer you've been with an organization, we find that the longer you've been with an organization, you do like the organization more. But also, the longer you've been with an organization, the stronger and stronger that continuous commitment becomes. Again, just staying with the company because it would cost too much to leave. And then we have social factors. So organizational support is one of the strongest predictors of affective and normative commitment. So again, if there's a lot of support, you start to feel normatively committed. Again, that's feeling an obligation. This company has done so much for me, I might as well stay. But also affective commitment. This company's done so much for me, therefore I like it. So supervisors treat employees considerately, and employee commitment about an R of 0.34. So again, we're looking at explaining about 10 to 11% of employee commitment, especially affective commitment, is coming from just how supervisors treat them. Also, how much supervisors communicate, how clearly they communicate, and how commonly and openly they communicate is also pretty strongly related with employee commitment. Role variables again, so again, not what role you have in an organization, but if there's ambiguity or confusion about your role in an organization, that has a negative relationship with organizational commitment. And organizational justice, again, does predict affective and normative commitment. So again, the more you perceive your organization as being just, that the decisions they make are based on data and you agree with them, at least it makes sense to you, and you perceive it as a just system, you're more likely to like your company, affective commitment, and you're more likely to feel an obligation to stay, normative commitment. Consequences of organizational commitment. So performance. Tough to find a strong relationship here. Affective commitment has performance ranges in the R of 0.15 to 0.25. So again, a moderate, small relationship between organizational commitment and performance. The relationship with contextual performance does appear to be consistently related with affective commitment, less so with normative and continuous commitment. So we find that depending on the job, depending on the situation, sometimes we find a relationship between affective commitment and performance, but not always. And we find generally we're more likely to find a relationship with contextual performance, but again, specifically with affective commitment. Withdrawal behaviors, we find the same model that we talked about before, and this time instead of job satisfaction being that initial attitude in the model, so the model on the far right, we have organizational commitment. Again, organizational commitment leads to attention motivation, but that motivation is also influenced by pressures to attend. Once we intend to motivate, or we are motivated to attend, again, our ability to attend further can muddy the waters of the relationship between org commitment and actual attendance. Again, affective commitment is our bigger predictor. It is related to absences, a small relationship, negative 0.18 to negative 0.22. So again, a negative relationship means the higher you're committed affectively to your organization, the more you like your organization, the less likely you are to be absent. And again, the attendance model. Variables other than attitude are coming into play about absences. So continuous commitment does not seem related to absence. Too little research on normative commitment, absence relationship. So basically, most of the research has looked at absence as related to affective commitment, or how much you like your company. When they've done research looking at just continuous commitment, again, continuous commitment means I can't leave. I've got too much invested. Doesn't seem to really be related to attendance directly. So having continuous commitment doesn't really result in you attending more. And again, research really hasn't looked much at normative commitment. Withdrawal behaviors, so turnover, leaving the company. Again, affective is the strongest one we find related to actual turnover. Again, we don't find a strong relationship between continuous and normative commitment. So even though continuous commitment is about the sunk cost, where you don't want to leave because of the cost of leaving, and normative commitment means you don't want to leave because you just feel obligated to stay. Neither of those are actually related to turnover. So basically, having normative or continuous commitment doesn't result in you being more or less likely to leave an organization. It seems like it's other factors that determine if you ever leave. However, if you like your organization, you are less likely to leave. Little research on organizational commitment and counterproductive behaviors, but there likely is a relationship between frustration and lack of commitment. So basically, if you're performing counterproductive behaviors, it's probably an example or an indicator that you have a lack of commitment as well. So we're going to talk about briefly now some additional job attitudes. So there's a lot of research out there looking for new job attitudes that will provide additional information above organizational commitment and job satisfaction. We're going to talk about job involvement and work centrality. We're going to talk about perceived organizational support, and we're also briefly going to talk about emotions in the workplace, since we're talking about attitude. So job involvement is the extent to which an employee is cognitively engaged in the job. So this isn't whether you like your job or not. This isn't whether you're committed to your job. This is basically just simply measuring how involving is your job. How busy are you at your job? How engaged are you in your job? It moderates the effect of job insecurity and negative job attitudes. So basically, if you have a situation where you're not sure if your job is secure, but you're highly involved in your job, it's less likely to result in negative job attitudes, health problems, and distress. So job involvement is rarely directly predicting performance or turnover or absenteeism. It's more of a buffer between negative events and negative outcomes. So the more involving the job is, the less impact negative antecedents will have on a negative outcome. Now, job involvement also is tied into the idea of a workaholic, enjoys the act of working, obsessed, devotes time and expense of other important work roles. So sometimes workaholics will be very involved with their job, so much so that it's destructive. And for a while, there was even kind of the thought that anyone that was too involved in their job was a workaholic, and that's a bad thing. There actually has been research that's found that there are some people out there that are what we call enthusiastic workaholics. In other words, they don't want outside life roles. They really do enjoy work to the exclusion of everything else, and they're happy in that role. So job involvement, 3 things to remember. Too much job involvement can result in possible negative outcomes, basically a workaholic situation. However, some people actually thrive at that level. And the more cognitively engaging a job is, can provide a buffer between negative events and possible negative outcomes. Work centrality is the degree of importance that work in general holds in an employee's life. So basically, it develops from socialization, and it is related to effective commitment. Work centrality is how central is your job, your work, your organization to who you actually think of yourself as. So basically, if someone asks, "Who are you?" and your very first thought is, "I am a professor at SIUE," that would suggest work centrality. You have a fair amount of work centrality. Work is very important to you. If someone said to me, "Who are you?" and I said, "Well, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm an American, I'm a professor," now that means that work centrality, that would be a good indicator that though work is important to me, it's not necessarily the most central important thing to me. So what we also find is that job involvement and work centrality and organizational commitment are all moderately correlated. So there's a little graph there that kind of shows this relationship. So all of them have some overlap with each other. Some of them, they're all influencing each other. The more work is central to you, the more you're going to be involved with the job, and the more committed you are. The more committed you are, the more the work's going to be central to you. And the more the work is central to you, and the more that organization that you're committed to, the more likely that the job actually is something that you're also involved in. So all 3 of these are similar constructs, but they're capturing slightly different elements. Perceived organizational support is a variable that's been getting a lot of research recently because it seems above and beyond. So when we're talking about job involvement and work centrality, we don't find really strong relationships between those 2 variables and performance or turnover or absenteeism. They seem to be more of protective things. So the more important work is to you, the less likely a negative event is going to result in you having a negative outcome. Same with job involvement. The more involving the job is, they're kind of buffers between the employee and reacting to maybe shocks to the system. Perceived organizational support has some more evidence about having actual antecedents and consequences. So it's a 3rd major job attitude being added on to job satisfaction and organizational commitment that seems to actually predict directly performance. So in perceived organizational support, POS, is an employee's global beliefs concerning the extent to which the organization values their contributions and cares about their well-being. So basically, POS is my organization committed to me, not am I committed to my organization. The antecedents are fair procedures, supervisor support, and favorable rewards and job conditions. The consequences, research has found POS is related to commitment, to increased performance, and to reduced withdrawal behaviors. It is strongly related to other attitudes. It's fairly strongly related to satisfaction and commitment. In other words, if you have high perceived organizational support, you'll also generally have high job satisfaction. You'll usually also have high organizational commitment. And it is fairly strongly related to turnover. So again, if you have high perceived organizational support, you're less likely to leave the company. It has a negative relationship with political environments. So remember, political organizations refers to a caustic environment where people are basically protecting their own self-interest and not helping the organization. So when that's occurring in an organization, especially among supervisors, you're usually going to find a very low level of perceived organizational support. Now, the reason that this has become a popular variable, though, is though it is highly related, you will find situations where someone is low on satisfaction, low on commitment, but high on perceived organizational support. In other words, I don't like my job, I'm not committed to it, but I do get a lot of support. My organization cares about me, I just don't care about my organization. We also find situations where basically you have someone with high job satisfaction and high commitment, but poor perceived organizational support. I love my job, I'm committed to this organization, but gosh, I really wish they cared about me. I don't think they do. So that's why it's been getting some traction as far as a third variable to look in the workplace. It is related to the other ones we've talked about, but it is also explaining something a little bit different. And research has found that above and beyond job satisfaction and commitment, it does explain more of variance in performance. In other words, it not more than satisfaction, but once satisfaction is predicted performance, once commitment is predicted performance, there's still some performance that can be predicted by adding POS. So briefly, I just want to kind of touch on emotions in the workplace, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about stress and well-being in the workplace. But emotions in the work, emotion regulation is the biggest thing we're worried about as far as how attitudes in the workplace can influence things. So it's the way in which an individual monitors their emotions. So basically, there's two things that we can do as far as emotional regulation. We can do amplification or suppression. So amplification is faking and exaggerating a pleasant emotion. So basically, if you're working, for example, at McDonald's, you're always supposed to say please and thank you, and you're always supposed to smile at the customers. That's amplification. You're faking or exaggerating a pleasant emotion. Now, what's interesting is that actually, if we look at social psychological research, we'll actually get to Schachter's two-factor theory of emotion. And what it suggests is that often behaviors occur first, and then the emotion follows second. And research has found that when people are required to amplify positive emotions in the workplace, often there is a relationship, at least a moderate one, to an increase in job satisfaction. In other words, if you pretend you're happy at work, you often end up thinking you're happy at work. Now, the problem with this is amplification as well as suppression takes effort. In other words, we can't amplify our emotions for free. It takes an actual cognitive effort, and it's distracting to do so, and it's also tiring to do so. Suppression is hiding displays of felt emotion, so such as anger as jealousy. So the more you have to suppress, this is actually related to job satisfaction. So if you're neutral and you amplify and fake pleasant emotions, you're likely to lead to job satisfaction. If you're neutral, you're not really having to do much suppression. But if you're angry, if you don't like your job, if you basically come to work kind of annoyed, and not only are you having to fake being happy, you're having to suppress that anger, that's kind of a double jeopardy. And that can lead not only to, in other words, in that situation, you're going to see job dissatisfaction. Emotional labor is the effort that we have to exert to do either amplification or suppression. So emotional regulation requires emotional labor. It's the effort, planning, and control required by employees to express organizationally desired emotions during interpersonal interactions. And some jobs require a lot of emotional labor, some require very little. Customer service definitely requires a lot of emotional labor. So what happens when we have a situation where employees' true feelings are different than the emotions they have to project on their jobs, we basically find emotional dissonance. So that emotional labor of either amplification or suppression does relate to higher levels of stress over time, relates to burnout, and it's again the importance of organizational and person job fit. So if you're needing someone in customer service, and that person is going to have to be projecting a happy attitude all the time, you probably want to find someone that's got a happy attitude to begin with. It'll be less stressful and require less emotional labor for them to do their job, and they'll experience less emotional dissonance. Emotional dissonance can also result in larger level kind of a dissonance between the emotions that you have about your organization and possibly the perceptions of others. So a good example of this would be British Petroleum or Beyond Petroleum. If you worked for Beyond Petroleum when there was the massive oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico, there might also be an example of emotional dissonance of you having to try to defend an organization that you yourself may not actually feel very good about. So both of these can definitely impact job satisfaction, organizational commitment, through, again, this idea of emotional dissonance. Well, that's wrapping it up on attitudes, and let me know if you have any questions. You can always post to the discussion boards or email me.